It started with a single, terrifying moment that would change everything I thought I knew about my neighborhood. One evening, after a long trip to the grocery store, I returned home and froze. At the very edge of my property, where I had meticulously built a barrier to protect our homes from the encroaching forest, a breach had formed. Cedar posts lay broken, wires sagged, and my tools were scattered as if some invisible hand had struck with purpose. My heart hammered in my chest as I scanned the shadowed tree line, trying to understand how this could have happened. The wind rustled the leaves above, and in that eerie twilight, every sound felt amplified. Branches snapping, a distant animal moving, the forest itself seeming to whisper a warning. I felt the weight of responsibility crush me. This barrier wasn't just wood and wire. It represented safety, preparation, and the boundaries I had fought to maintain. As my gaze traveled along the line, I realized the enormity of the threat. The boars, wild, massive, and unpredictable, could slip through that broken gap at any moment. The serene suburban facade of Pine Hollow, with its neatly trimmed lawns and quiet streets, had been shattered in a heartbeat. And yet there I was. Elijah Brody, mid-40s, rugged in flannel and jeans, frozen in disbelief and anger, realizing that the very system I had trusted to maintain order, the HOA, led by Janice Mallory, now saw me as the problem rather than the solution. Could a single man stand against the bureaucracy, the arrogance, and the relentless demands of a neighborhood association while facing a tangible, dangerous threat from nature itself? I clenched my fists, forcing myself to breathe, knowing that any hesitation could mean disaster. The twilight deepened, shadows stretched across the gap, and I knew that the coming hours would test every ounce of resilience I had. This wasn't merely about a barrier anymore. It was about survival, about proving that responsibility and courage could outweigh control and fear. Every rustle in the leaves, every flicker of movement in the forest, reminded me that the line between order and chaos had been crossed, and that night would mark the beginning of a battle I never imagined I'd face. I had moved to Pine Hollow years ago, drawn by its charm and quiet streets. The neighborhood was a place where children laughed freely, neighbors exchanged greetings across fences, and mornings carried the scent of fresh pine and mown lawns. I, Elijah Brody, mid-40s, rugged in flannel and worn jeans, often walked the edges of my property, taking a moment to absorb the subtle rhythms of this suburban oasis. Each home bore the mark of meticulous maintenance, painted shutters, manicured lawns, and carefully curated flower beds. The HOA signage, subtle but omnipresent, reminded residents of the rules we all followed, and I had largely complied, keeping to the letter while quietly questioning their intent. There was a peace here, fragile but present, a sense that the world could slow down, that problems could be managed, that safety was assured. And yet beneath this calm surface, there was tension I couldn't yet see. It lingered quietly, a shadow between the trees, a whisper in the breeze. The barrier I had built along the forest edge seemed, for now, a simple precaution, a line between order and the unknown. But Pine Hollow had taught me that serenity is often a mask, and sometimes the very people entrusted with protecting it are the ones most eager to disrupt it. Walking the line that morning, I felt both pride in my careful work and an unease I couldn't quite place. It was a fleeting sense, dismissed in the warm light, but I didn't yet know how. Quickly, it would escalate into a confrontation that would test every principle I had relied upon. Later that evening, my motion sensor captured movement outside my property. Expecting raccoons or wandering wildlife, I was startled to see Karen, outfitted in a reflective vest, cargo pants, and gloves, carrying a tape measure and clipboard as if conducting a covert survey. She measured the distance of my truck from the lawn, scribbled notes, and held a stud finder against the fender, her intensity bordering on obsessive. I stepped onto the porch and called out calmly, "Evening, Karen." She gasped and muttered about conducting an assessment, justifying her trespass as part of her newly fabricated initiative. I reminded her of the limits of authority. There was none here. She protested, insisting that timing was irrelevant when maintaining harmony. I stood firm, pointing out that she was trespassing and that her actions were being recorded. She froze, momentarily confronted with the undeniable reality of surveillance. This brief confrontation was emblematic of her pattern. Boldness unchecked by consequence until reality intervenes. Karen retreated into the cul-de-sac, her reflective vest catching the streetlights like a deranged firefly, signaling not surrender, but a temporary withdrawal to recalibrate her campaign of imaginary oversight. By morning, neighbors reported receiving similar letters, identical in form but legally meaningless, threatening further action unless they complied with her voluntary contributions. The absurdity of her persistence was clear, yet it highlighted the psychological impact she had, wielded over the community for years. Her obsession with control, her repeated efforts to manipulate, and her imaginative bureaucracy were all manifestations of someone, deeply compelled by relevance and authority, even when neither was legitimately hers. For me, it was a moment of clarity. Understanding the nature of individuals like Karen is crucial. They operate on a different plane, believing in the righteousness of their imaginary power, and only systematic documentation, calm observation, and measured response can counteract their influence. Residents would learn gradually that real authority stems from responsibility and respect, not fear or intimidation, and that the true measure of leadership lies in restraint, legality, and integrity, not in the ability to issue fines or control shadows. The room had never felt heavier than tonight. Everyone waited for the storm they had been warned about. A woman in control only of her imagination, Karen Allen, the self-proclaimed protector of vehicular. Harmony marched to the front with the confidence of a monarch. Every step reverberated through the hardwood floor, a subtle drumbeat of authority that didn't belong to anyone but her. She planted herself beside the podium, clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield, her fake earpiece glinting in the dim lighting. Jill, the board president, stepped forward, attempting to calm the room and take control of the evening. But Karen's interruptions came fast, sharp, precise, words designed to intimidate and dominate, each syllable a calculated effort to assert power over people who were only there to protect their own driveways. As the murmurs of residents rippled across the room, I stood silently against the wall, folding my arms, watching. Not to intervene, not to rescue, but to witness the spectacle of someone unraveling. The tension crackled in the air like static, a tangible weight pressing down on every shoulder. This was more than a meeting. It was a psychological battlefield, and Karen was armed with nothing but her delusions of authority. Slowly, methodically, Jill asserted her rightful position, commanding attention without raising her voice, letting every word land like a hammer. And Karen, confronted with true authority, faltered. For a moment, the air shifted. The residents, who had lived under the shadow of fines, threats, and nonsensical regulations, felt a collective breath of relief. The room was alive with the promise that chaos could be challenged, that power built on fear could be dismantled. In that instant, I realized that authority, genuine authority, was not measured by clipboards or rules invented on a whim. It was measured by courage, by calm, by the willingness to confront wrongdoing and stand firm. Karen's defiance, once so intimidating, now seemed fragile. Every muttered threat, every raised finger, every dramatic pause revealed the cracks in her self-constructed empire. And as the board prepared to vote, I understood something deeper. This was not merely about fines or wheel clamps. It was about the illusion of control versus the reality of responsibility. Tonight, the neighborhood would witness a rare victory of order over delusion, of reason over chaos, and of truth over fear. The lesson was quiet but unmistakable. Those who impose authority without legitimacy are destined to crumble when confronted by integrity, patience, and the courage to document, observe, and act. And so the stage was set, not for a spectacle of humiliation, but for the affirmation of genuine leadership. Karen Allen's empire, built on shadows and paper, would face its reckoning. The residents, weary but resolute, were about to reclaim their community. Karen Allen's obsession with control had reached a fever pitch that evening. She crouched by the vehicle, her hands gripping the metallic wheel clamp with the precision of a general preparing for battle. Every action was deliberate, every motion a statement of her imagined authority. Residents watched from their windows, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering with nervous tension. What began as minor annoyance had escalated into full-blown manipulation, a performance of power meant to intimidate and remind everyone who supposedly ran the neighborhood. I documented every moment, photographing, recording, observing, knowing that this display was not just an act of enforcement, but a declaration of identity. Karen's world was one of rules that existed solely in her mind, regulations crafted to command compliance and foster fear. As she circled the vehicle, checking angles, confirming the stability of the clamp, her face twisted with intensity. It became clear that she derived satisfaction not from actual justice, but from the illusion of dominance. The air hung heavy with tension, and I could feel the collective anxiety of the neighbors pressing against the thin walls of reality she had constructed. They had endured fines for imaginary violations, verbal threats over trivial matters, and now the tangible evidence of her obsession, the immobilized vehicle. This was no longer a game. Her audacity, untempered by legal authority, had crossed into harassment, a violation of trust, and an assertion of power over people who simply wanted to live without fear. My role, calm and methodical, was to ensure that documentation was complete, that every transgression was captured, and that when the time came, accountability would follow. And then came the moment that would define the evening, the recognition that no matter how elaborate her tactics, no matter how dramatic her gestures, the weight of reality, laws, evidence, and the resolve of the community would stand taller than any clipboard. Wheel clamp or self-appointed title, Karen Allen, for all her intensity, was a reminder that authority imposed without legitimacy is always temporary, and that order, patience, and thorough documentation are the tools that ensure justice prevails, even against the most theatrical and determined of adversaries. The night air was thick with the kind of tension only obsession can create. Karen Allen moved with purpose along the driveway, her reflective vest catching the faint glow of streetlights, clipboard in hand, tape measure in the other. To an outsider, she might have appeared as a concerned neighbor, conducting some necessary inspection. But to anyone familiar with her escalating pattern of control, it was a display of fixation, a ritualized effort to assert dominance where none was granted. She measured angles with meticulous care, compared distances with obsessive precision, and scribbled notes with a fervor that made her entire body tremble with satisfaction. Every motion was an assertion of imagined authority, a performance designed to convince herself that her influence extended beyond imagination into reality. I stepped onto my porch, observing silently, arms crossed, documenting every movement. The residents, asleep or unaware, could not yet grasp the surreal nature of the scene. A woman fully convinced that order could be enforced with tape measures, stud finders, and relentless attention to imaginary codes. The quiet clicking of her instruments, the soft scratch of pen on paper, became the soundtrack of obsession. This was not governance. It was a manifestation of control unchecked by logic or legality. Yet as much as her actions were frustrating and irrational, they offered a crucial insight: the distinction between authority and delusion, between legitimate enforcement and the theater of imagined rules. And in the stillness of that night, I realized that patience, observation, and documentation were not passive acts. They were the foundation of accountability, the safeguard against chaos, the preparation for when reality must inevitably intervene. Karen's meticulous measurements, her intense focus, and her unwavering belief in her role as guardian of vehicular harmony would eventually collide with the consequences of her own construction. And in that moment, I understood the patience required to confront such delusion, the discipline necessary to remain composed, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, despite the intensity of the performance, order, evidence, and integrity would ultimately prevail over obsession and control. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the suburban driveway as Karen Allen stood triumphantly with her laminated map in hand. Her gestures were theatrical, precise, almost ritualistic, as she pointed at a vehicle that had somehow become a symbol of chaos in her self-fashioned empire. The neighbors watched from behind drawn curtains and slightly ajar blinds, a mix of curiosity, anxiety, and silent defiance reflected in their eyes. Karen's voice rose and fell with dramatic urgency, each sentence carefully, constructed to assert dominance over spaces and people that had never consented to her authority. Her map, filled with circles, arrows, and scribbles, seemed to pulse with imaginary importance, as though the roads, driveways, and lawns themselves owed her obedience. I remained on the porch, folding my arms, watching every gesture and listening intently. Each word she spoke, each exaggerated movement, was a reminder of how easily one can confuse obsession with power. And yet, amidst the absurdity, there was a subtle brilliance in her performance. She had mastered the art of psychological control. But mastery without legitimacy is fragile. With every dramatic declaration, Karen unknowingly revealed the fragility of her empire built on fear, misinformation, and self-importance. Residents who had long endured fines for minor or imagined infractions began to feel a quiet strength grow within them. They realized that the only real authority comes not from intimidation or theatrics, but from community, fairness, and the unwavering courage to document, observe, and act with patience. As Karen continued her performance, circling vehicles and narrating supposed violations, it became evident that her reign was more symbolic than practical. And yet that symbolism held power only until challenged by the truth. Tonight the neighborhood would witness not a battle of paper and maps, but a lesson in the limits of control and the quiet triumph of resilience over obsession. In that moment, I understood that documenting every act, observing every tactic, and remaining steadfast in calm was not passive. It was the preparation for accountability, the guarantee that reality, not delusion, would prevail. The evening settled over the neighborhood like a soft blanket, yet tension hung thick in the air as Karen Allen remained, under the solitary glow of the streetlight. Her clipboard, a constant companion, reflected the faint amber glow, emphasizing her rigid posture and intense focus. She seemed to exist simultaneously in two worlds, one dictated by reality, where neighbors were simply trying to live peacefully, and another ruled by her imagination, a place where every driveway, every parked car, and every shadow was subject to scrutiny and control. I observed quietly from the edge of my porch, knowing that any direct confrontation could escalate into chaos, but that careful documentation would ensure accountability. The neighbors, though invisible from this distance, felt the weight of her presence, the unspoken reminder that for weeks, months even, they had been subjected to regulations that existed only in Karen's mind. And yet, for all the intensity of her stance, there was a fragility beneath the surface. Authority built on obsession, fear, and self-importance is inherently unstable. And this was the perfect example. Every step she took, every glance she cast, revealed a desperate need to assert relevance in a community that had largely stopped acknowledging her power. It was a masterclass in the psychology of control. By making others question their own rights, their own judgment, she sought to elevate herself. But the truth was persistent, unyielding, and patient. While Karen Allen enacted her nightly patrol, measuring, observing, and enforcing imaginary violations, the foundation of her constructed empire showed cracks. And in those cracks, I could see the inevitable collapse that comes when obsession meets reality. By the time the streetlight flickered and shadows danced across the pavement, it was clear that vigilance, careful observation, and documentation would triumph over delusion. Karen's presence was imposing, yet ultimately powerless in the face of law, patience, and truth. Her empire of fear would remain temporary, and those who had endured her tactics could begin to feel the faint stirrings of liberation, a quiet affirmation that control without legitimacy is fragile and fleeting. The tension in the street reached its peak that afternoon when Karen Allen, fueled by obsession and delusion, dramatically unrolled a massive poster in the center of the neighborhood. Residents peeked from behind curtains, whispers traveling like ripples across the community. Her poster, a blown-up map filled with arrows, circles, and ominous labels, depicted vehicles as threats and driveways as zones of potential chaos. It was a surreal performance, a vivid manifestation of someone's need to control a world that didn't require regulation. I watched silently, my camera documenting each gesture, each wild proclamation, knowing that her actions, while absurd, were evidence of a pattern that could no longer be ignored. Karen's voice rang across the street, echoing with the conviction of someone convinced of their own authority. Yet, for all her bluster, the scene revealed her vulnerability. Every arrow, every red circle, every dramatized note was a cry for relevance, a desperate attempt to impose order in a neighborhood that had moved on. The residents, initially tense, began to recognize the fragility of her performance. Authority rooted in fear, theatrics, and self-imposed rules collapses when faced with calm, methodical observation, and the steadfast presence of law. As two sheriff's cruisers arrived, the energy shifted. Karen's dominance was challenged not with anger, but with evidence and lawful authority. Her reactions, screams, rants, and proclamations only underscored the contrast between imagined control and real responsibility. That afternoon became a turning point, a living example of the distinction between authority built on legitimacy and power constructed from fear. Karen Allen's theatrics, while spectacular, could not withstand scrutiny, patience, and justice. The residents, watching quietly, began to feel the first flickers of relief. The reassurance that chaos and intimidation could be countered, documented, and ultimately neutralized. The lesson was clear. Fear may intimidate temporarily, but responsibility, evidence, and integrity endure. Night had descended on the neighborhood, painting the streets in deep indigo and casting long, mysterious shadows across lawns and driveways. Karen Allen moved with meticulous purpose near one of the driveways, her reflective vest catching the glow of the porch lights like a beacon in the darkness. The clipboard in her hand was her constant companion, her shield and her symbol of authority, though none recognized it as legitimate. Each step she took was deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if the act of walking itself asserted dominion over spaces that belonged to others. I watched from the edge of my porch, noting her patterns, documenting her behavior, and remaining ready to intervene should her obsession cross legal boundaries. The stillness of the night contrasted sharply with the energy radiating from her movements. It was a silent performance, yet its impact was loud, unsettling, and meticulous. For neighbors who had grown weary of her imaginary regulations and unauthorized fines, this was another night of quiet intimidation. But what I noticed above all was the fragility beneath the intensity. Karen's obsession, no matter how theatrical, was tethered to a reality that did not acknowledge her authority. Each measured step, each scrutinizing glance, revealed the inherent instability of her power built on fear, illusion, and delusion. As she knelt briefly to measure tire angles or scribble notes about invisible violations, it became clear that obsession thrives on the absence of accountability. But accountability was quietly present. I documented everything. Motion sensors, cameras, and careful observation ensured that each step, each action, and each overreach would not go unnoticed. Karen's nightly patrols, while dramatic, were ultimately impotent in the face of law and patient observation. She was performing a grand spectacle, a self-directed play where she was both tyrant and audience. Yet the script was unsustainable. By sunrise, the street would return to calm, the shadows would dissipate, and the spectacle would fade. But for now, Karen Allen moved through the night like a phantom, a reminder that obsession and delusion can occupy space quietly, but can never withstand truth, law, and steady documentation. The morning sun illuminated the neighborhood with a soft golden glow, but tranquility was a fragile illusion as a curious envelope sat in the mailbox. Printed on linen paper with a gold seal, it bore the name Bluff County Oversight Initiative, a title that sounded official, but was entirely fabricated. Karen Allen had outdone herself, transforming her obsession into a formal-looking document designed to intimidate and manipulate. I held the envelope, carefully examining every detail. Professional printing, precise folds, and a return address that offered no legitimate trace. Inside, the document detailed supposed regulations and required appearances, with fines and contributions subtly suggested, all pointing to a PayPal account under her name. The audacity was astonishing, the precision meticulous, and the intent clear. Control through fear and the illusion of legality. I photographed each page, added it to my growing evidence folder, and contemplated the implications. Karen's need to assert relevance extended beyond our immediate neighborhood. She had transformed her obsession into what could now be considered fraud. For neighbors, the document was simultaneously baffling and threatening, a reminder of the psychological hold she had maintained for months. Yet this time, there was a key difference. Law and procedure were poised to intervene. Deputy Hernandez had reviewed previous incidents, and with sufficient evidence now gathered, formal charges could be considered. Karen Allen's elaborate performances and self-fashioned initiatives, once terrifying in their immediacy, were now exposed under the light of accountability. Her initiative existed spiritually and symbolically for her, but the law recognizes tangible, verifiable authority. As the morning unfolded, it became clear that obsession, no matter how theatrically presented, is vulnerable to methodical documentation, patient observation, and decisive legal response. For the neighborhood, relief mingled with wariness. Peace was near, but the memory of her theatrics lingered. And for me, each photograph, each document, and each careful observation reinforced a fundamental truth. Power without legitimacy is temporary, and accountability, when consistently applied, restores order, dignity, and the sense of safety every resident deserves. The night air was crisp and silent, carrying the subtle rustle of leaves across the property line. From the shadows near the edge of the woods, a solitary figure appeared, unmistakably Karen Allen, her reflective vest glinting faintly under the soft moonlight. She remained perfectly still, almost as though she were a statue or a ghost haunting a space that was no longer hers to command. Her gaze was unwavering, directed toward the cabin as though measuring imaginary boundaries, evaluating invisible threats, or silently plotting her next maneuver. There was no paperwork, no clipboard, no muttered orders, only presence, a tangible reminder of past obsessions and the fragility of control built on delusion. For over 10 minutes she stood there, not stepping onto the property, not approaching the cabin, yet the weight of her scrutiny filled the air with tension. Every inch of her posture radiated both defiance and resignation, a mixture of pride in her self-appointed authority and recognition that her empire had crumbled under the steady hand of accountability. I watched from a distance, documenting every second with a trail camera, understanding that this silent vigil was less about me or the truck and more about her struggle with irrelevance. Karen's war was never truly against any physical object. It was against invisibility, against the notion of being forgotten, against the limits imposed by reality on her imagined dominion. As the night stretched on, her figure eventually receded into the trees, leaving no trace but a quiet sense of tension and a reminder that obsession, even when restrained by law, persists quietly, haunting the edges of our lives. The following morning, reviewing the footage confirmed what I had felt. Karen's presence was a message, a final act of persistence without overreach, and an affirmation that the battle between delusion and accountability, however dramatic, could be observed, documented, and survived without surrendering one's peace. The quiet of the afternoon was abruptly shattered when Karen Allen appeared in the center of the street, wielding a massive poster that seemed to encapsulate her obsession with control. Children peeked curiously from yards. Neighbors leaned out windows with cautious anticipation, and the tension was palpable. The poster, sprawling and meticulously marked with red circles, arrows, and labels like unknown vehicle energy, zone, and driveway dominance risk, elevated her delusion into a public spectacle. Each dramatic gesture, each declaration of supposed threats and violations, was intended to intimidate and reassert her authority over a world that had largely ignored her previous demands. From a distance, I observed silently, knowing that any immediate confrontation would escalate the chaos, yet understanding that this performance was documenting itself for accountability. The arrival of sheriff's cruisers brought a shift in energy. Karen's theatrics collided with lawful authority, her imagined empire confronted by real consequences. As Deputy Hernandez approached and handed her formal charges, her reaction, shrieks, proclamations, and rants underscored the fragility of power derived from obsession rather than legitimacy. For the neighborhood, this confrontation was both surreal and cathartic. The visual spectacle of her poster, once intimidating, now symbolized the ultimate collapse of imagined authority in the face of evidence, law, and patient oversight. Karen's performance highlighted a critical lesson. Control rooted in fear, theatrics, and illusion can captivate temporarily, but accountability, clarity, and the steady application of truth will always prevail. Residents, watching quietly, felt the tension ease, realizing that while her obsession was vivid and dramatic, it was ultimately powerless against integrity, documentation, and lawful response. This confrontation became an enduring example for the community, a visual and emotional testament that even the most flamboyant displays of control cannot endure when met with patience, truth, and structured authority. Weeks later, an unassuming package arrived, delivered without a return address and addressed simply to the cabin. It was small, yet carried the weight of a peculiar intent. Carefully, I opened it, revealing pink tissue paper, and beneath it, a silver box, elegantly designed but innocuous. Inside, there lay a diffused glitter bomb, rendered completely harmless. A symbolic gesture crafted with precision and creativity. A note taped to the lid read, "This is what restraint looks like. You're lucky I'm taking the high road." The message was clear. Karen Allen, ever inventive, had decided to make one final statement without crossing the line of legality. It was simultaneously a peace offering, a symbolic act of rebellion, and a reminder of her presence beyond immediate reach. The glitter, harmless though it was, represented her flair for dramatics, her desire to leave an imprint, and the persistence of her obsession even when constrained. It struck me that while her authority had been challenged and dismantled legally, her need to assert identity and relevance could not be entirely erased. For the neighborhood, her absence allowed a return to calm and everyday life. Yet her gestures reminded us that some personalities never truly vanish. They relocate, adapt, and continue their narrative elsewhere. Observing the gift, I reflected on the fine line between harmless creativity and disruptive obsession. Karen's action was theatrical yet controlled, a testament to the ongoing tension between imagination and accountability. The incident reinforced a broader lesson. Dealing with persistent individuals requires documentation, patience, and understanding, and even symbolic acts can carry meaning without escalating conflict. In that moment, I realized that resilience, vigilance, and measured response were the most effective tools to protect peace and maintain order, while still acknowledging the human need for expression, however eccentric. Months passed, seasons changed, and life in the cabin returned to a steady rhythm of calm and routine. Yet news arrived that reminded me Karen Allen's influence was not confined to our neighborhood. Tanya, from the county records office, brought a folder containing incomplete paperwork for a new HOA roughly 30 miles south. The proposed president? Karen Allen. Her relentless drive to assert control, to establish her own oversight, was beginning anew in a fresh, unsuspecting development. The papers were sloppy, unsigned in multiple areas, but one section stood clear, deliberate, and unmistakable, her name in bold ink. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in her obsession, a replication of patterns she had perfected over time. While the residents there were unaware of her history, I knew the likely trajectory: theatrics, attempts at dominance, and creative yet unauthorized oversight. I chose not to intervene directly, understanding that some lessons are learned only through experience. Karen's departure from our neighborhood was a relief, yet the memory of her actions lingered as a cautionary tale. In observing her new initiative, I reflected on the essential principles of community: authority and responsibility. Control derived from fear, delusion, or imagined legitimacy collapses under documentation, law, and ethical clarity. Yet the human need for relevance, recognition, and purpose persists, sometimes manifesting in eccentric or disruptive ways. Watching the sun glint off the young trees and the emerging homes, I realized that life, peace, and community thrive not through dominance, but through respect, patience, and shared responsibility. Karen Allen may have relocated physically, but her patterns, her obsession, and her symbolic gestures remained instructive. This final chapter underscored a lasting truth. Real authority is earned, sustained by integrity, and measured by respect, not by clipboards, theatrics, or imagined power. For those who follow, the lesson is clear: document, observe, and uphold order, while understanding that human nature, in all its complexity, may always seek relevance, expression, and sometimes dramatic spectacle.